You just have to let the little red bar get to its completed place. And then have to let the little red bar. All right, we're live. Got it. All right, hello everybody. Sorry about that little blip. Good evening. We have quite a crowd tonight. Pretty busy for this time of year. Maybe you're taking a break from the craziness. Hope everyone is well. Many of you already know me. I'm Lucy Helfrich with the 300 Committee Land Trust. And you know our speaker too, Mike Tucker. I think many of you have joined us for previous talks given by Mike. Tonight, he's going to be talking about winter birding on Cape Cod. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Please note that you will all be muted throughout the talk. If you're not muted right now, please mute yourselves. If during the talk you have a question, please type it into the chat. At the end, Mike and I can scroll through and hopefully get to all of your questions. Also, we are recording on YouTube. It will be available on the 300 Committee's YouTube channel, which is really easy to access right from our website. Just look for the YouTube link, click on it, and you'll see all of our recorded talks right there on our channel. Quickly, a few words about the 300 Committee. I especially want to thank our members and supporters who make it possible for us to permanently preserve special places in Falmouth. Membership also helps us manage and steward the lands we've protected, now more than 2,500 acres across all of Falmouth's villages, and to make these special natural places available and accessible to everyone. This, of course, is always important, but I think we all know that it's been especially so during the last challenging couple of years. If you are not yet a 300 Committee member, we do hope you will join us. You can make a membership contribution right from our website, 300committee.org. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mike Tucker, an outdoor enthusiast, a talented photographer, and an all-around great guy. His fascination in and passion for birds developed when he was just a kid, when he got his first pair of binoculars, and he has an immense catalog of bird knowledge that he loves to share with others. Indeed, many of you have attended other Mike talks or have joined him on his fun and informative bird walks on a variety of local conservation lands. Tonight, Mike will share photos and tips focusing on birding on Cape Cod during the winter months. Let's get started. Welcome, Mike, and thank you.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, a lot of people don't like birding in the winter so much. They feel like it's kind of useless and there aren't a lot of birds around, and that's partly true. It's definitely different, and you need to know where to go. You need to know what it is you're looking for, and understand that they aren't all over the place like they are in the spring and summer. They kind of concentrate in areas where they find food, water, and shelter. And those are always three important keys when you want to find wildlife. And certainly in the winter, it's very important. I try to put it in perspective a little bit. Birds are warm-blooded creatures, and think about the fact that they don't have the ability to go inside their house and put the heat on or put on a winter jacket. But what they do have the ability to do is find food to maintain that energy level. And that's really important. So, it's even more challenging in the winter because there's less food. It can be trickier. It can be tough for them to find it. So finding key areas like that where they can survive is where you're going to find the birds. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. I want to talk at first about some online resources and what you can do, because like I said, it can be overwhelming. Sometimes you can go for a walk on the beach and you won't see a single bird. You could go for a walk in the middle of the woods in the winter and you might hear just 2 or 3 birds. So we'll talk a little bit about the sort of places you want to focus on. But this resource right here is also very helpful. And eBird has a feature that I use a lot. And the picture on the left, it's called Explore. So you can punch in the county, and that's listed as Barnstable right there. And it will list all the different birds that have ever been recorded through eBird in Barnstable County. But the nice part is each bird has that, has that bar graph next to it. And you can tell by the amount of green, whether it's blank or whether it's a thin line or whether it's filled up, that just corresponds with how frequent they're seen within that month. So if you're looking for a particular species, you're like, geez, I want to find a Barrow's goldeneye today. It's a nice feature to go to because you can scroll down and right next to the bird's name, the first little blue box pulls up what you see in the top right-hand side. It's a map that shows all the recent sightings. Now, not all the recent sightings, it shows all the sightings basically, but the red indicates the recent. So it's really nice to be able to say, okay, within the last month, you know, whatever, in this case, it is Barrow's goldeneye in that picture. That's where they've been seen. And as it happens right here in Falmouth on the Shumet Pond, they've been seen over the past month. So it's very helpful. In fact, I use that as an example because when I first moved here, I expected Barrow's goldeneye to show up on the rare bird alert, which is the email I get that you see in the lower right. Basically, you can sign up for a daily summary or you can do hourly. I do hourly. It doesn't seem like a lot, but the way Google, I mean, it seems like a lot, but the way Google does it, it puts it all in the same email and you can just scroll through all the sightings. And I'm like, why isn't Barrow's goldeneye showing up on Cape Cod? I don't even get it. Well, as it turns out, Cape Cod is in its own other world. And the reason why it wasn't flagged as rare is because it's so frequent on Cape Cod and regular, not that it's common, but it's regular, that it doesn't flag as rare. At least most months it doesn't. And the month, because I actually found one and reported it, I'm like, why in the world isn't it flagging as rare? And that's why, because it all has to do with how often things are actually seen, whether or not you get that email in the lower right, whether it's flagged as rare in your county or not. But anyway, it's very handy and helpful. And we'll talk about some other things you can do. Now online, there are some resources as well that I picked a few that really pertain to Cape Cod, well, two of them especially. The Falmouth Wildlife Group, I know many of you are members of. We have over 6,100 members. And it doesn't include just Falmouth, it includes the bordering towns. And on Wednesdays, it could be sightings from anywhere in New England. So we have a lot of people. It's very surprising how many have ended up joining this group. It's very active, but it can be really handy if you're new to birding or you want to start getting into it, to join a page like that and you kind of see what's going on. You'll see, you know, somebody posting some birds that you never knew were around town, and now you could go for a drive on the weekend and go find them. So it's very handy. Cape Cod Birders encompasses all of Cape Cod, Barnstable County. So that's another site. That one has over 5,000 members. So both of them are very active, good resources to get a feel for what's going on around you. The one on the right is the Massachusetts Rare Bird Alert. That's a little different. It's statewide. That's good to be on because those are for the real rarities, not just something uncommon or kind of rare. That's for the real hardcore rarities. So once in a while when something like that pops up and you see it on Facebook, you may or may not decide to go for a little drive to go get yourself a rarity. So those are a few good resources on Facebook anyway. And of course, joining walks. You know, there are lots of options out there. I mentioned a few that are common around here. The 300 Committee, of course. Mass Audubon does a lot of great walks as well as the Cape Cod Bird Club. I do a few for them now and then. It's a great way to get out. You meet people and just conversation walking around. You might actually learn of some places, little out of the way places that you never even thought of. You know, so, you know, it's just a good networking sort of thing. You meet a lot of like-minded people. You learn of new places to go, and it's a lot of fun. And it's a good way to learn birds too. Now we're going to get into identifying key habitat in the winter. The first thing I'm going to mention is it's very different than going out in the middle of summer or spring, going for a walk when things are breeding. When you go for a walk in a dry upland woodland in the middle of winter, there's a good chance you're not going to hear or see much at all. You know, it doesn't hold a lot of wildlife value as much as some of these other areas I'm going to talk about. Not to say it's completely vacant of birds, and I'll talk about some of the ones that you see in some of these drier woodland habitats. But the sort of things I look for when I go for a drive might surprise people in some ways. You know, in the right-hand side there up top, it's just a picture of the roadside. I mean, believe it or not, places like that along roadsides can really be active. We have all that brush. Disturbed areas of land like you see on the left where there's a dirt mound and it's sprouted up all kinds of invasive species. Those invasive species produce a lot of food. You have thickets for cover. The picture below it, same thing. There's a little bit of Phragmites popping up there. There's all kinds of invasive weeds all over the dirt mound. The reality is, when the earth is disturbed, that provides prime opportunity for these invasive species to take hold. And that actually provides a lot of food for birds in the winter. That may sound like I like invasive species, definitely not. The reality is that invasive species overtake habitat, and food is not the limiting factor when it comes to bird populations. It's habitat loss. That's really the biggest factor, and that's where invasive species come into play. So they're really bad for sure, but where they do show up and we have them in different areas, it can be a magnet for birds sometimes, where you have these thickets of weeds and growth and bushes like that. And the power line areas, like I show here, so these are areas that are always cut. So you always have sort of these early sort of successional stages of growth where you have these shrubs popping up that are cut back every year. A lot of weeds with seed heads on them. Great place for lots of different things, ground feeding birds, sparrows, juncos, things like that. So I always check out places like this. You know, if I'm going to go out and do a big day of birding and I want to see how many species I can get, you can bet I'll be covering habitat like these here. And, you know, believe it or not, the top left picture and the lower right picture is a dump. I was at a dump in Rhode Island, in Tiverton, Rhode Island, and I go there every year. It's part of my Christmas count area that I cover. And it is a absolute hotspot for birds because it's one of those spots where they're always moving the earth around. There's invasive species of weeds and grasses and shrubs all over the place, lots of cover. And where they scrape up the ground, you get puddles of water all the time. Another important key element for finding birds. And plenty of food around. So, you know, you get a little bit of everything in a place like that. It might not be the most scenic place in the world, but the birds don't care about that. They just care about food, water, and shelter. And there's plenty of that in a place like that. So I mentioned earlier about, you know, going for a walk on the beach and not seeing much. One of the things that most people do when they go to the beach is they walk along, you know, the actual shoreline, and they're looking out over the water. That's beautiful. I get it. I do a little bit of that. I don't spend a lot of time. When I go to a place like South Cape Beach, I cut up to the actual shore a couple of times and see what's out there, looking for waterfowl and, you know, loons and gulls and things like that. But the back dune trail, the Dead Neck Trail there, for example, you know, you have all these areas on the left. It's kind of like the back dune area where you have a lot of sparse growth and dune grass. Places like that can be fantastic for birds that require that kind of habitat. I mentioned in the previous slide, a couple of slides, about thickets and cover and that sort of dense cover they like, but not all birds feel safe in that situation. Things like horned larks and snow buntings, even eastern meadowlarks you'll find in the dunes like this here. So you can find all kinds of things that you're not going to see out on the beachfront. And of course, these areas are tempered by the ocean. So it may get windy at times, but you know, these areas on the Cape, they just don't get quite as cold as interior Massachusetts, interior New England. So you can find a lot of things in places like this. The other pictures show a little bit further back in the dunes where you have a lot of bayberry and juniper. Sometimes you come across black pine. So if I'm going for a walk along a trail that goes in the back dunes and I come across a thicket like this, I always stop and listen and look. And, you know, you just really, those are the sort of places where you're going to find flocks of birds. Those are the sort of places where, you know, mixed in with some common things, you might find something unusual. So I always spend a lot of time in places like that. Excuse me. I mentioned listening, by the way, in the previous slide. That's a really key thing to do too. You know, when you are going for a walk in the woods and you hear something common, or along a trail where you got, you know, bike path or wherever it may be, and you hear some chickadees and maybe a couple of titmice, you're thinking, well, I know what they are, you know, you just kind of keep walking. But no, you definitely want to stop and see what's going on, because there are these communal flocks of multiple species that will join. And when you see a bunch of chickadees and titmice flitting around, chances are there's some other good birds in there too. And we'll come across some when we start looking at individual species, and I'll talk a little bit about those. So I talk about identifying habitat when you're out and walking around, but certainly in your own yard in the winter, you can provide some good elements that will attract birds to your yard. And I've mentioned the phrase in previous talks on feeding and attracting birds. On the left, what you see is a heated bird bath. I just kind of propped up in I added a few extra rocks. I raised it up a little bit. And yeah, I mean, a heated bird bath when everything else is frozen in the winter is an absolute bird magnet. I mean, any kind of bird will go to it. Where, you know, bird feeders, we get certain kinds of seed. Not all birds go for seed, but every bird will go to water. So that's really important. And what you see on the right of that is just a brush pile. It's like, you know, it looks ugly, you know, but if you got a spot on the edge of your property where you can create a brush pile, I got a couple out behind my house right now that I'm going to just leave for the time being, and in the spring I'll clean it up. But it provides good shelter for birds. And they like having those places, if they're going back and forth to feeders, a place where they can feel safe. And what you plant in your yard makes a big difference too. And in the winter, having evergreens like you see in the left, whether it's white pine, cedar, you know, things like that, holly, you name it. There's a lot of rhododendron, a lot of those things. It provides great cover. And that's the sort of thing that's just a nice element to have in your yard. And that's just a homemade little bird pond I have on the right there, the redbreast and the hatch at it. Start talking about some individual species now. And we'll start with some sparrows. The white-throated sparrows are a winter visitor. They start showing up later in September, and they'll be here all the way into May. They're a fun little bird, but they're not always out in the open and easy to see. They're common going underneath bird feeders and feeding on the ground. They love feeding on the ground. But they'll go in a lot of these shrubs, whether it's privet hedge or, you know, bayberry or other things, and they'll eat berries as well. And what you see here is a typical adult white-throated sparrow on top. You see that very strong, clean line of demarcation on the throat where it's got a black border. And down below, it's a dingier, younger bird, but a white-throated sparrow nonetheless. You'll see that little splash of yellow in the lower area up front in each case. And you'll always see that with them. The same sort of habitat you'll find them whether it's just kind of, you know, shrubs along a roadside or the edge of your yard. You got a good chance of seeing swamp sparrow as well. They are a little bit more secretive than white-throated sparrows and not quite as numerous, but they're around. When they're breeding, they're pretty much exclusively found in wetlands, so wide open sort of marshy areas, places like that. But in the winter, you'll find them in overgrown fields, thickets, roadside edges, places like that. And of course, song sparrows are everywhere. They are absolutely numerous in this town. But it's good to show the song sparrow in relation to some of the other ones, because sometimes at first glance, a lot of these can look very similar. Song sparrows have, you know, the heavy streaking underneath always. They have the very long tail and that little sort of Fu Manchu sort of malar stripe, they call it, dropping down. It's a very wide one that kind of opens up. You don't really see that on the white-throated sparrow, and it's thinner on the swamp sparrow. So all these little sort of identification things. Uh-oh. My cat just came in. I forgot to lock him away. We'll see how this goes. I usually put him down the hallway. But anyway, so we're going to look at some other sparrows here. Now, when you get outside of the Cape, I mentioned that eBird rare bird thing earlier. What's really strange for me sometimes is when I'll go for a walk and I'll go to Crane or some of these other places, and I'll see field sparrows in November and December. I'll see a few chipping sparrows. I mean, it's a regular thing out here. And then you check your email later on and you see the rare bird alert. All these other counties in Massachusetts are reporting them like it's a big deal and they flag as rare. So we really get a lot of unusual things out here because of the more, you know, sort of buffered climate from the ocean all around us. It makes a big difference. There's a lot of great habitat out here for birds like this. And the chipping sparrow can be a little tricky in its winter plumage, a younger bird especially. But the key thing is that dark line through the eye. There's a little remnant of that sort of rusty cap that it's going to get when it's an adult. Field sparrow has a lot of similar markings in the winter, as you see during breeding season. And the dark-eyed junco is pretty unmistakable. When you're driving down the road, sometimes you'll see a whole flock of birds flitting off on the roadside, and juncos love those sort of places. And again, I'll find a safe place to pull over and I'll hop out of my car. There'll be traffic going down the road and I don't care. I'll have my binoculars and camera, and I'm curious what else I'll find mixed in with juncos. You know, whenever you see these birds, you know, you're not going to find any rarities. You're not going to find any uncommon ones if you take these common ones for granted and think that's all that's there. You just keep moving. It's really, you know, important to sort through all these birds. That's how you find the good ones. Well, they're all good. That's how you find the uncommon ones, I should say. Speaking of uncommon, Vesper Sparrow and White-crowned Sparrow and Fox Sparrow all kind of venture into that category a little bit. Neither of those are rare, but these are the ones that I always get excited when I find. And Vesper Sparrow has popped up in this town in a few places. A couple of places that come to mind that are popular include Peterson Farm and Crane. Those are always great places for that bird, but it's not like you're going to go in there and see a few of them. You're going to go in there and maybe see one, but they're fairly regular. And hold on 1 minute because I'm fighting off a cat with my left hand. I'm going to go put them. This will only take a second. Sorry, Sean, we're going to go bye-bye. Yes. Yes. COVID meetings, doing it at home and dealing with children and cats. Anyway, so where was I? So anyhow, Vespa Sparrows and are always fun to find. And last two times I was at Crane off 151, I found white-crowned sparrows. You're not going to see big numbers of those at all. So I always get excited when I come across them, and that's also a good spot for them. Fox sparrows I find along the bike path, Peterson Farm, a few other places in town. If you learn some of these call notes, it can be very handy. They have a very harsh call note that's much different than the other sparrows. And when you learn it and you hear it, it really jumps out at you. So it's really important to learn those. Not important, but it can be useful. Let's put it that way. Now, the fox sparrow you see heavily marked underneath, much different than the brown streaks of a song sparrow. It has that deep rust color to it. It has a lot of that color on the back as well, and that beautiful gray contrasting on the head. So a very unique bird. They're very large for sparrows too, as are the white-crowned sparrows. Couple of species here, actually one species here, one species and a subspecies. The Savannah Sparrow is a grassland nesting bird that breeds out at Crane and a couple other places in town. They do very well there. And it's a bird that's been declining in the Northeast, probably over 70% in the last 50 years, which is huge. So wherever you have that sort of nice habitat of grasslands, they actually breed there, but they winter over there as well. And you'll find them in places like, the town compost site. I go in there on off days and walk down and go around the leaf piles and all that stuff, and you'll see winter and Savannah sparrows mixed in with some of the other ones. It's a good place to look for a lot of different sparrows in there, actually. And the Ipswich Savannah Sparrow, you're not going to find in those places. It's a subspecies that breeds in a very specific area of Sable Island up in Canada, and they're very unique when they show up here because you're only going to see them in dunes and on beaches and those sort of places. I've seen them at Woodneck Beach. I've seen them at South Cape Beach, places like that. Sometimes in the back dunes, sometimes on the beachfront itself. This one was feeding right on the water's edge last year when I photographed it. I always get excited when I find them. They just look like a muted, sort of washed out version of the typical Savannah Sparrow we see. The streaking is usually thinner and has almost a pinkish tone to it, and all that light gray around the nape and the back of the bird is just much different than the Savannah sparrows that actually breed in town. So some of these areas like the grasslands I mentioned, you're going to get different birds that you're going to get, in some of the sort of roadside and brushy areas and along the bike path, places like that. And eastern meadowlark that also breeds at Crane like the Savannah sparrows do, winter over there as well. And that's pretty unheard of in most of New England to have eastern meadowlarks wintering over. But again, here in Cape Cod, things like that happen. And I was just there a few days ago. I pulled into the parking lot late in the day, and sure enough, I saw two of them flying across the field. So they do well there. Now, some of the lower areas, the shortcut grasses and, a place like Scusset Beach, if you've ever been there, the parking lot, you get the parking lot and you get the campground. There are these large shortcut grass fields between it. Hornlarks love those sort of shortcut grass areas. They also love some of the barren parts of the back dune areas where there's not a lot of dune grass, it's just sand. I saw hornlarks at South Cape Beach the last time I was there. So those are good places to look for birds like that. Snow buntings will often mix in with hornlarks. Sometimes you'll see them along the beachfront, actually in the sand, kind of foraging around. A Lapland longspur is one of those birds that I always look for when I come across a flock of hornlarks or snow buntings. You don't always get them, but once in a while they show up. They mix in a lot with hornlark flocks. And one of the things you notice when they take off, they have white outer tail feathers that really jumps out at you. This picture doesn't show it very well, but in the center of the bird there, right on the wing, it usually has a chestnut patch that shows up pretty well. And last time I was at Scusset Beach, I didn't report it on the eBird, shame on me. I did have a Lapland longspur there just about a week ago. Get into some other birds here, some finches. Now, purple finch and house finch are commonly, somebody needs to mute themselves. Purple finch and house finch, sometimes are easily confused with each other. The reality is purple finch is much less common, and it's not a bird that we see a lot of anymore. House finch is all over the place. It's actually somewhat of an invasive species in a way that was introduced from southwestern US, and now they are everywhere. And looking at these two, just a couple of quick differences. Notice the dark brown streaks that kind of go down the flanks on the house finch and down into the lower belly a little bit. And not the purple finch, you just have that sort of color kind of going down the flanks and muted in. Sometimes there's some buffy sort of brownish streaks that don't have the hard lines that the house finch has. But there's also a lot more color in the face and the back. You can't see the back of the purple finch very well, but you can see the house finch wing, and it's just brown. A purple finch actually has a lot of color in the wing. And it also has a bit of a crest on its head that it shows a lot. And you can see it kind of lifted up there a little bit. Pine siskins are one of those birds we call an eruptive finch. There are a couple other ones that we're going to look at. But the pine siskin sometimes will show up in huge numbers. And last year, it was crazy when they started showing up in October. People were reporting 50, 100, 200 in a flock, just descending down on their deck and just wiping out bird feeders. And I mean, they were everywhere. I shot this photo over at Tony Andrews' farm where they had some, sunflowers and some weeds around the edge of the farm, and the pine siskins were all over the place. So I put the goldfinch in there. Everybody knows what a goldfinch is. But just to keep in mind that they're very similar in shape and behavior. They will mix in with goldfinch flocks. And even though they're an eruptive finch where they only show up once in a while, dependent on what the cone crop is like up north and a few other factors, it is the one eruptive species that still shows up in some numbers, usually every year. And there have been a few reports on the Cape over the last month or so of pine siskin, and I think I had one flying overhead not long ago. So keep your eyes open on your feeders. They'll go to the thistle like the American goldfinch. They'll go to sunflower seed, and always fun to see. Beautiful little bird. Now the gray catbird is another one that interior Massachusetts, interior New England, in the winter you just don't get them, but very common here in the Cape. I had one yesterday. They love those sort of thickets, where they might be breeding in a lot of different places. They spread out, all around town in so many different places you can find them. In the winter, you're going to find them more around some of the coastal thickets, along the bike path, the edges of wetlands, places like that. You'll find them interior as well, but you're going to find more of them in places like that. Mockingbird, same deal. I grouped these two together because they're both mimic thrushes. A catbird isn't very good at mimicking, but they make a lot of noises nonetheless. And a mockingbird is very good at mimicking. They can imitate all kinds of things, even man-made objects. They usually do it with 3 or more phrases of whatever partial sound they're imitating, and then they'll go on to another one and just work their way through their repertoire. What's interesting about northern mockingbirds is in the wintertime, they actually form a territory. Most birds do not do that, and they fiercely guard a couple of bushes or their favorite bush that's loaded with berries, and they'll chase anything away. And they're really fun to watch. I've watched one, I've mentioned this in another talk, fighting off a flock of European starlings in this coastal Rhode Island spot, and the poor thing just did not give up. There's probably over 100 starlings, and it kept diving at everyone that went into the bush, and he just didn't give up. It was pretty impressive, I gotta say. couple other birds, the hermit thrush. We get a lot of those in the winter here. We probably get an influx of them. They love coastal, shrubby Cape Cod. They just love it. And where you're going to find them, where there's really dense the sort of stuff you just can't walk through, bullbriars and really thick tangles of invasive vines and, just dense bushes and shrubs, the edge of wetlands, the edge of clearings, you name it. Any place that has that sort of really dense sort of vegetation, you have a good chance of getting a hermit thrush. Now, not long ago, I did a walk for the 300 committee and we were going through Salt Pond. And I think a lot of people got to hear it. They can be easily overlooked, with their call notes, and it's just a soft chuck. Everything else might be making, chickadees might be noisy, the titmice, the cardinals, might be all kinds of call notes. Birds are flitting all over the place, and a busy, flock that's feeding. You'll hear this little soft chuck, chuck, and that's the hermit thrush. That's all they really do in the wintertime. But it's very distinctive, and it's the only bird that makes a sound like that. So again, one of those things, once you learn it, it's how you find birds sometimes. You're not usually going to see them right away, but you're going to hear it before you see it. And eastern towhee, a lot of people seem surprised that they winter over here, but all from Cape Cod all the way down through coastal Rhode Island and Connecticut, there are good numbers of them, and every Christmas count usually turns up quite a few of them. And I just had one yesterday, actually. So, the towhees are around. They just aren't around in the same numbers because they do breed heavily all across Cape Cod. But same deal like the hermit thrush, and the catbirds. They're just going to kind of show up in some of these other areas, these roadside places that I pull over that just, I might not have ever birded it in my life. I might be driving by and I'll see a few birds flying across the street and I'll pull over. And these are the sort of birds that I'll find in places like that. Eastern bluebird and American robin winter over here in good numbers. Every year in the spring, I'll hear some local, weathermen say, hey, I guess spring's here. We got reports of bluebirds or, robins. Well, they winter over here in big numbers, actually, by the thousands. There are some places in southern New England where there are roosts of several thousand robins that go in every night to roost. They don't all do those large communal roosts, but they will, do smaller ones and just move around locally. There'll be some individual ones, but all around Cape Cod, salt pond sanctuaries is a great place for robins. Are always in there in good numbers, as are the hermit thrush and towhees and things like that. And the bluebirds winter over as well. So both these birds have the ability to switch over their diets where, when they're feeding their young and they're nesting, they're grabbing lots of invertebrates, whether it's, worms and little bugs and all kinds of creepy crawlies. That's what they love. But once fall rolls around, they really take advantage of the berries. And we have lots of those. I mentioned earlier the invasive plants. And one of the dynamics that's changed in southern New England is the fact that, a lot of open space has disappeared to highways and power lines and neighborhoods and parking lots and, and all these areas where you have roads slicing through what used to be open space. You now have roadsides that get invasive species, neighborhoods that get invasive species and ornamental shrubs. And all these things have changed the dynamic. And now we see more and more robins wintering over here than we did, let's say, 50 years ago. And that's true with a lot of species of birds, the Carolina wrens and these other birds that have, a lot of them have benefited from the fragmentation of these areas. And, the flip side is a lot of birds have suffered. So, some birds thrive in these sort of disturbed areas where the land is fragmented up, but other birds do well, and wintering birds seem to take advantage of it. As you're going along the bike path from like Trunk River down by Salt Pond and just walking that stretch where there's a lot of, wetlands and shrubs and Rosa rugosa and all these other multiflora rose and other invasives, it's just great habitat for things like yellow-breasted chat. I want to thank Andrew Gaffney for this photo. He posts on the Falmouth Wildlife group a lot, fantastic photographer. And they're a tough bird to get photos of. And I remembered he recently had one and he was kind enough to let me borrow it. It's a fairly good sized bird. And if it was turned at you, the bright yellow chest area really jumps out at you. It's everything else can be pretty dull in the winter, and you just see this large splash of bright yellow pop up like that. It's always exciting to see. They're very elusive sometimes. They're very shy. They don't usually give you much of an opportunity to take their photo or to even get a good look at, but now and then they pop up for you. And they make a lot of what I would describe as similar to catbird sort of notes. Cedar waxwings, they rove around in flocks in the winter, just going all over the place. And this I photographed over at Knobscot Point. I drive by there a lot, and I always see cedar waxwings flying around. Across the street from the lighthouse, you get all those cedars going down the hillside. They're always in that area. I've come across them in a lot of places, but they have those high, wispy sort of notes that you hear, very thin note. And when they're in flight, they do that. So again, using your ears, just walking down a path somewhere and you hear that, if you follow the noise and you see where they settle down, you're going to get yourself some looks at an absolutely gorgeous bird. Love cedar waxwings. So we do get a few warblers around here in the wintertime. Some more common than others as we look at this page here. Orange crown warbler is probably the least common of the ones that we'll see in the wintertime here, but they're still pretty regular. In the Northeast, out of all of North America, the Northeast is probably the toughest place to find an orange crown warbler. But coastal southern New England in the wintertime, Christmas counts all over southern New England, usually turn up one or two in every count. And one day, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had 3 of them in one day, and I couldn't believe it. This was one of them. And 2 of them were over by Brivogel Ponds. So, you never know where you're going to come across these. If you just listen closely, you're going to hear all kinds of sparrow notes, which are very similar. And then you hear this very soft, thin little chip. And the orange crown warbler just kind of sticks out compared to a lot of the other notes that might be going around. Palm warblers, having a few of them just last weekend at Brivogel Ponds along the large sand area where they got a lot of dune grass planted in there, along the edge of the pines. Certainly places like South Cape Beach and Crane, places like that where you have these overgrown sort of fields, or you've got shrubs or pockets of vegetation along dunes. You're not going to find them in deep forest. You're not going to find them usually in the middle of the field that's absent of any kind of shrubs. So they just like that sort of, shrubs in openings, near clearings, edge of clearings, those sort of things. And pine warbler, I was really surprised last year how many I found over the course of the winter. They do really well here in the winter. People see them at bird feeders all the time. They'll go to sunflower seed, and you get off the Cape, it becomes a really good find to find a pine warbler in the middle of winter. Out here, it really isn't that uncommon. I get excited when they come to the feeders here, and I got a few pictures of them in the middle of winter feeding, which I couldn't find for this talk. But yellow rump warblers, on the other hand, are very common compared to all of these, and they aren't a neotropical migrant. They always winter over here in big numbers. And pretty much any place you go along the shore where you got pockets of shrubs or trees near the shore, you're going to find yellow rump warblers somewhere. They look very different in the winter than they do in the spring. And but if it flies, you do see that yellow rump. If it gives you the right angle, you do see that yellow rump. Talk about a couple of wren species here. Excuse me a sec. On the left is the winter wren, and I've yet to get a killer photo of a winter wren. That's the best I got. They're really tough. They're secretive. They like really down trees, like you see one walking on the tree there on the left. This is one of the ones that you will find in the middle of deep woodland sometimes, places like, around Long Pond, the trails around there, we have these a dense understory with fallen trees and branches all over the place and piles of brush. They love that sort of habitat, but they also like, shrubs along a stream, places like some of the inland trails at South Cape Beach, the Great Flat Pond Trail, and some of the places, even along the Coonamessett River, where you find these, thick patches of shrubs near water. They'll find places like that as well. They do these little chatters that are different and not quite as noisy as the Carolina wrens are. They're very subtle. They get the short, tiny little tail that sticks up, very dark, and a lot smaller than a Carolina wren. Beautiful little bird, and always fun to find. The Carolina wren, very vocal, and that's one of those species that I mentioned earlier has really thrived with the fragmentation of open space here in the Northeast, and just how the dynamic of the landscape has changed, and they are absolutely everywhere. Go back 60, 75 years, they were uncommon. This is a bird that has moved into the Northeast from the southern part of the US, and now they're everywhere, and they winter over pretty easily. They do well. And it's also one of the birds that will sometimes belt out its actual song in the wintertime. Not too many birds will sing in the middle of winter. On a nice day, you might hear a white-throated sparrow or song sparrow do it once in a while. Carolina wrens do it a lot. I could probably list a long, list of habitat you can find them in. They're just all over the place, but always fun, beautiful little bird, and they're pretty entertaining. Some tree creepers, birds that like going along the trunks of branches and trees. The brown creeper, another one of those ones where places like Long Pond and some of the larger stands of forest might be a good place even in the middle of winter for those. Again, you're not going to get a ton of variety in places like that, but that's a bird that does love that sort of habitat in the middle of winter. These guys do as well. Of course, both on the right are common bird feeder birds. The white-breasted nuthatch and red-breasted nuthatch both nest around here. And again, I use my ears. Sometimes these are the noisy ones in a flock. I was at Coonamessett Pond not long ago. I took the trail up to the little boat launch area, and I heard two red-breasted nuthatches just going at it like crazy, just constantly making a noise. And I walked in a little ways to see what was going on. And it's my guess, because some other birds came in, that there might have been a small owl in there, but I never did see what was going on. I never did see the owl, if there was an owl, but sometimes their scolding calls can alert you to other birds. Sometimes they find something like a bird of prey and they just make a racket. And it's good to pay attention to that. When you hear that sort of unusual scolding and they're just mobbing behavior, you never know what they have, and it's always worth checking out. Oops, sorry about that. Couple of unusual species of woodpecker, one pretty rare. The yellow-bellied sapsucker, you got the adult on the left, and the little sub picture down below is a younger bird. And they aren't terribly common on the Cape, but they will winter over here. What you will find with these is that they'll go to a favorite tree quite a bit. And if you find a favorite tree that they like to go to, you'll find these horizontal rows of holes that they do. That behavior, all these little rows, it just looks like somebody took a little pencil and was jabbing it in the tree and just did another row and then did another row. There's these little horizontal rows, and that's what a sapsucker does. Now, on a warm day, it'll visit those holes and sap oozing out of it. It will take advantage of that. And then later in the season, or earlier in the season, when there are a lot of insects around, they're actually attracted to that oozing sap, and then they take advantage of the insects that are attracted to the sap. So they're kind of resourceful little guys, and not too common. Peterson Farm usually has one every fall, might still be hanging around. I decided to throw in red-headed woodpecker last minute because I just learned of one on Cape Cod, and it didn't make eBird. It's on a private property. It's a really tough one to find. This is a young bird, so it doesn't have the complete red hood, but everywhere where you see brown, an adult bird would have a very deep red color there. And the wings aren't so mottled looking with white in it. It's jet black with that white wing patch. Just a striking looking bird. But quite often when one shows up here on Cape Cod in the winter or fall, it's a young bird that kind of lost its way and it's just hanging around. And the bird that I saw a photo of today was a young bird. And I don't know if it's going to stick around, but I wouldn't mind trying to add that to my Cape Cod list. I don't have that on Cape Cod yet. Tiny, cute little birds, golden crown kinglets and ruby crown kinglets. Once you get into midwinter, the golden crown kinglets are much more common. These will flock together with the chickadees and some of the other ones. So again, good reason to stop when you hear any bird calling, even one that you might be familiar with, because it's always fun to come across them. And I actually took this picture just over the weekend, and it was a flock of over a dozen golden crown kinglets, which is a pretty good sized flock for them. Usually there's just a few mixed in, but there was a whole bunch of them, and that's a conservative estimate. And ruby crown kinglets, you don't usually see in flocks like you see the golden crown kinglets. You'll come across one here and there. Once you get into the middle of winter, they become less common. They tend to stay in the sort of dense little thickets like a winter wren might be in, for example. And they actually do a little chatter that might even be similar to a winter wren. And they had that chunky, tiny little body, very similar to them as well. So in behavior and shape, superficially, there's some similarities there. But notice the eyes, it has the white, what we call eye arcs on the front and the back. And the golden crown kinglet, has the very distinctive markings on the head with the black and the gold color across the middle. The male will have a little bit of bright orange right in the middle of that gold stripe. Beautiful little birds, always fun to find. Usually the kinglets stay higher up than the ruby crown kinglets, so you hear them up in the canopy moving around, but they'll come down the feed as well. I mentioned eruptive finches earlier, and these crossbills fall under that category. And last year was a big year for red crossbills here on Cape Cod. In fact, they were here right through until May. And this red crossbill on the left, I photographed off of Sandwich Road, and there were flocks of them everywhere. And usually the flocks would be anywhere from like 10 to 20 or 30. And they have a very distinctive sound. They all fly together in these tight flocks. And when they do that, it's pretty unmistakable. You hear them, they're always noisy when they fly. And they like settling down into pitch pines, spruce, places like that. And on the right is the white-winged crossbill. We don't see them showing up as much. This is the female. The male basically looks like a red crossbill with white marks on the wings, more or less. But this was taken down in Rhode Island, and we had a big flight of white-winged crossbills one year, many years ago. Get into some birds of prey now. Now, red-shouldered hawks don't nest all over the place here on the Cape, but they do breed here. But in the wintertime, this end of the Cape, Falmouth and Sandwich, I think we get a few little extras showing up. Some birds from interior New England will just be a short migrant. They aren't true migrants, not like a broadwing hawk. They're not going to go down to South America every year, but they will move around. So we'll get wintering birds showing up here on the Cape from time to time. And I threw in a picture of an adult and what an immature bird looks like. And I wanted to throw that immature bird in there to show you how similar it can look to the red-tailed hawk on the right that has a little bit of a belly band and has the cleaner chest. It's a larger bird, and an immature red-tailed hawk also has some stripes on the tail, very similar to what a red-shouldered hawk has. There are a couple other things. If you could see the back of a red-tailed hawk, it has these white markings that sort of form a V on the scapulars, and the underwing is very distinct, whether it's an adult red-tail or a young red-tailed hawk. That wing pattern always holds true, and it's much different from a red-shouldered hawk. Excuse me. Love harriers. They are just so graceful to watch and absolutely beautiful birds. And we live in a good place for them. Anywhere from Great Sippawisset Marsh down to Woodneck Beach and all across southern, the South Face and beaches here. We get them cruising along the coast, Salt Pond area, all the way down. They go out to Waquoit and across South Cape Beach area. So it's a good place to see these guys cruising around. What you see on the left is an adult female. They're considerably larger than a male. And if you look closely, this picture shows it well. You see a bit of a facial disc similar to what an owl has. And they actually move their head around a lot when they're flying. They listen. They're really fun to watch. They're very animated in flight. They do they'll pull up and almost like they put on the brakes when they hear or see something, and they'll kind of do a little bit of a hover. They might move on. They might drop down on the prey. A lot of fun to watch. Super graceful, very long tail. They hold their wings in a dihedral, unmistakable once you learn that silhouette, shape, and behavior. And they just love the marshes and the dunes and large fields like crane as well. You'll see them flying around there. And on the right, you see the male. The top right picture, I kind of lucked out one day at South Cape, and this male came in. It's cropped in quite a bit though, but it came in and landed on this piece of driftwood on the marsh side. And you could see just this beautiful pale gray color on the back. It's highly variable. Sometimes there'll be a little bit of buff color in the wing on the males, but this one didn't have any of that. It was a really remarkable looking bird. And the underwing is much different than the female as well. You can see that clean, bright white with the contrasting black wingtips. It's hard to mistake it for anything else in shape, behavior, and just the beautiful, unusual look they have. We get a couple of species of falcons showing up around here as well. And merlins love the sort of barrier beach areas, crane. They just like wide open areas. Same thing with a peregrine falcon. I think you're more apt to get a merlin hanging around in a few places around here in midwinter, but peregrines will show up too, because wintering birds that we have around here are from the extreme north, more than likely, and they tend to just move around a lot. So you might see a peregrine one day hunting along the beach, and the next day it's gone, but a merlin might stick closer to home. You're more apt to see it more often. And they're very similar in flight, both powerful flyers, both, go for birds. Merlins will go for other things now and then, but unmistakable. A peregrine falcon, as I mentioned in Hawk ID talks, they seem to defy physics. They have this whip-like sort of wing motion, and they just go flying through the air so fast. And a merlin, steady wing beat, like they mean business, and just powerful birds, and they like harassing other birds. Merlins are notorious for that. They'll go after anything, they'll harass anything, and it seems like they do it just for fun sometimes. Cool little bird. Bald eagles have gotten a lot of attention around here over the last couple of years. We've just been seeing more and more of them, and now they're actually nesting on the Cape. And there's been a lot of reports around our end here in the Falmouth area over the last couple of weeks. There was one right around Main Street the other day. There was one in North Falmouth. I think there was another report of one over near Wacoit. And so they're around. And as we move more into winter, a lot of the birds we see are birds that are migrating from Canada and some of the other places further north where things always freeze over. So those birds always migrate. Now, birds that are in our climate west of us, they may or may not migrate. If things aren't freezing over and they're happy where they are, they'll just stay there. But a lot of the birds, when we see an influx of them, you can usually bet are birds from further up north, more often than not. Although, we'll get some local ones too, but a lot of the ones are from further north because they just can't find food once everything freezes over. So it takes about 5 years for a bird to get the complete white head and white tail. Sometimes in 4 years, it'll look awfully close. You might see a little bit of markings in the head and tail. And what you see on the right is a typical second year bird, highly modeled and kind of no rhyme or reason. It doesn't seem to be, terribly patterned, and it can be highly variable. But there are certain areas of white and dark where you can still accurately age them for the most part. They are every bit as large as an adult, by the way. Some people think the younger birds aren't. As soon as they fledge, they are every bit as large as an adult. And it is another year for snowy owls. And there is a lot of them around, a lot of reports of them. And, I sound like a broken record because whenever I do a talk and I talk about owls, I always have to talk about ethics a little bit. These birds don't always show up in big numbers, but when they do, there's a couple of things that you can pretty much count on. They didn't want to migrate, number one. They either left because there was an abundance, bumper crop of owls. Basically, there was a lot of them. There was a successful year. They had a lot of food. But now the adults, it's basically like, you get out of here. We don't want to migrate. You have to go. And there's not enough food for all of us. So get out of here. So that happens a lot of times in, late in the fall and early winter, where the adults will drive the young ones off territory. So we'll see them showing up. So again, they don't plan on migrating. So they don't stock up like a blackpoll warbler might double in weight before they migrate. A snowy owl's like, okay, but I'm kind of hungry. They're like, I don't care, get out of here. So sometimes they leave hungry and they get here even more hungry. And sometimes they're partially emaciated. So they really need their space. They really need to be able to hunt. Another reason why they might leave is simply harsh conditions. We'll see adults showing up in those cases where they're leaving because they just can't find food. Another situation where you might find some weak snowy owls showing up. The problem is everybody wants to get a photo. Everybody wants to approach them. And I've read a comment on a Facebook group, thankfully not one of mine, last week, where there was a little bit of an argument. The guy's like, oh, I don't know why everybody gets so upset. To me, if I can walk right up to the owl and it's not injured, I'll do it. Obviously, it's fine. And I was like, oh my God, no, 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 no. You got it all wrong, buddy. The object of enjoying wildlife and photographing wildlife is not to get as close as you possibly can. It's to give them space. It's to let them be comfortable where they are, to not stress them. A bird isn't flying because it doesn't want to fly. It's trying to conserve energy. And eventually it flies because it has no choice. And the other problem is if you have a line of people kind of circling around trying to get their beautiful shot of an owl, not only are you stressing the bird out, but you're also inhibiting its ability to successfully feed because everybody's standing all around where it wants to feed. So you just need to leave them alone. They need their space. You know, not every situation, not every photo of a snowy owl is unethical. There are plenty of situations where, you know, you kind of find a good spot, they fly by, or, you know, a bunch of cars are pulling up and it's sitting high up in the dunes somewhere. And today's lenses, you can crop in tight. So I always caution people to not get all upset when you see a great picture of a snowy owl, but I speak up when I actually see it happening, when I see people being unethical. I try to remind them, hey, this isn't what you want to do. And I try to spread the word in talks like this as well. And that same sort of thing is true for every owl. I went up to Plum Island last winter because I really wanted to get to see some short-eared owls, and boy, did I luck out. It probably ended up being my favorite picture of an owl. And I was along the road, and there was a bunch of photographers hanging out. They're like, oh yeah, there's a snowy owl way out there. I mean, a short-eared owl, and it came flying in and landed on this stick in front of everybody. I could not believe it. Just a spectacular bird. So they love the marshes. They love the back dune areas. Same thing like snowy owls. You'll find them in similar places. And in the wintertime, they'll show up. And we do have some shorebirds that are around here. And the trifecta of usual ones are sandalling, ruddy turnstone, and dunlin. Now, ruddy turnstone isn't one that shows up all over New England, but we're pretty fortunate here, even Cape Cod, not all over Cape Cod, but Woodneck Beach and Black Beach in that area, always every winter has a flock of ruddy turnstones, and you'll often find dunlins mixed in with them. Dunlins can, at first glance, look similar to sandalings. They usually have a warmer tone to them, a little bit more buff or brownish color, but that curved bill, longer curved bill, is really distinct. And so they'll mix in, all three of these will mix together sometimes, but usually you'll see dunlin and sandaling mixed in a lot of places. Just the turnstone aren't quite as common. And greater yellowlegs here on Cape Cod, they winter over, in some small numbers anyway. You know, it's one of those things that will show up on Christmas counts. I actually had 4 of them at the big marsh behind South Cape Beach just a week or so ago. So they're probably still around because we really haven't had any harsh weather. The marsh isn't icing over or anything like that. So again, Southern New England, Cape Cod, you're going to find things like that, where other places, not so much. We're pretty fortunate to have such a variety here. I'll talk about a couple of diving birds here. Horned grebes is a species that used to be around in much larger numbers. I don't have any stats to back it up, just my own experience. Places I used to go to where I'd see dozens of them offshore. I'd be lucky just to find a few of them now, but they're still around. You know, any of the south-facing beaches, any of the Buzzards Bayside areas, you're going to see them out off the coast. You're not going to see them in sheltered bodies of water usually. Occasionally they'll go into harbors and large bays and places like that, but for the most part, they're off the beaches. Pie-billed grebes, on the other hand, usually like the sheltered little bodies of water. I've seen them at Salt Pond. I've seen them in small bodies of water like the Red Brook Road, where that little small pond is, or the stream flows through. That's actually where I got this photo about 3 weeks ago. So they're a fun little diving bird, cute little guy. Usually they're a freshwater breeding species, and usually if there's freshwater spot around, they prefer that. But some of the coastal salt ponds, you'll see them in there once in a while too. And just completely not related to them, but I had to throw in a shot of a razorbill somewhere in here. Further out on the Cape, you see a lot of them. Certainly off of Provincetown, the last time I was out there, there was flocks of, I mean, we probably had a few hundred fly by when we're at Race Point. Just, they were all over the place. And that's where this photo was taken. Actually, no, this was at McMillan Pier. But great place to go look for them, by the way. But we do get them here. And I've seen them off of Nobsca Point. I've seen them on the Buzzards Bay side off of Woodneck Beach. and I've seen them off of Stony Beach as well. So they show up, not always, but certain conditions bring them in. When you get some storms with like northeast winds in the winter, they'll push in, and sometimes they just stick around once that happens. Beautiful little bird. And the gannets, there's been quite a few of those around. I took a drive not long ago along the south-facing shore from the heights all the way down to Minot. And everywhere I stopped, I looked out with my binoculars. I saw gannets flying around. They were even off of Nobska Beach as well. And if you find a large flock of them, they can be super entertaining because they'll just go into these dives and go headfirst into the water. They just fold their bodies right up. Pretty impressive to see. And it takes them 3 years to get adult plumage. And you see an adult here on the left, and I believe a 1-year-old here on the right. So we get 2 species of loon regularly here, and I've been seeing both quite a bit lately. And I just wanted to point out a couple of differences here. The red-throated loon has more of a serpent-like head, where its head is no thicker than its neck. Where a common loon, it looks like a big blocky head sitting on a thick neck. And notice the bill on a common loon is thicker at the base. It's more stout looking. And the red-throated loon has that thinner up-curved look to it. Also that clean line of demarcation on the dark on the back of the neck and the white that starts on the sides. And it's a little bit more less pronounced, less defined on a common loon. And then the back of a red-throated loon usually looks speckled. There'll be some of that on a common loon, but not as evenly speckled across the back. And they are a little smaller as well. Gorgeous birds. By the way, a great place to see common loons and get good close-up photos is that little road along Deacons Ave where you can just go right along Falmouth Harbor. Just park right next to the fence, roll down your window, and that's exactly how I got this shot here on the right. So we're all familiar with Canada geese, but sometimes we get some good ones around here. Now, I mentioned a couple of times that we're fortunate to get a lot of different things out here in the Cape that the interior Mass and New England doesn't get. Well, kind of the opposite here. There are a number of places that routinely get snow geese, and right now there's a pink-footed goose in Plymouth, I believe. I know Rhode Island, a couple other places has had greater white-fronted goose lately. But it doesn't happen out here on the Cape as much. They seem to bypass us for whatever reason, but they still show up. And this pink-footed goose was taken out in Chatham, I think it was, last year. Showed up in just a ball field, like where people just, play baseball. It was just hanging out with some Canada geese. That's a very rare bird. That makes the national RBA, rare bird alert, when that shows up somewhere. The snow goose shows up once in a while, mixed in with Canada, and there's a dark morph and there's a light morph, and that's the dark morph. Some people call the dark morph the blue goose, but that's not really what it is. It's just the dark morph of a snow goose. And if you look closely on the greater white-fronted goose below, there's actually 2 of them. There's one on the right-hand side. And this was mixed in with some Canada geese in Tiverton, Rhode Island, several years ago. It's the best I can manage. I've never been close to them, unfortunately. Some common birds we see all around our shoreline here and some of our coastal ponds as well include bufflehead, red-breasted merganser, and hooded merganser. Now these guys are all pretty common. Diving birds going for fish, bufflehead being the smallest duck in North America. And we'll see them in a variety of coastal ponds. Red-breasted mergansers favor the salt water, but you'll see them in freshwater once in a while as well. Same thing with buffleheads. You'll see them in fresh and salt. Common merganser you really won't see in salt water. It's very, very uncommon. They like the larger bodies of freshwater, places like a Shumet Pond, and some of the larger ones when you get further out on the Cape. I've seen them out in Long Pond as well. And notice the difference between the red-breasted and the common is that strong line of demarcation on the red going to the breast of the chest area there. It's just a clean line going across the bottom of the neck with a common. It just all blends in with a red-breasted merganser. They're also a larger bird and some other differences that you can look at. But that from a distance is something key that you notice with the females in particular. Unfortunately, this is the best shot I have of a Barrow's goldeneye. I've seen them many times, but they're always sitting way out in a pond somewhere. And this one I actually photographed in Long Pond I think it was the first year I moved here, and I took it through a spotting scope with my cell phone, trying to hold it in there. Common golden eyes are quite common, and you can see the difference here. Notice the head shape of a Barrow's golden eye is very unique, and that white teardrop sort of shape in front of the eye instead of the irregular sort of circle sort of shape on the common golden eye. But when I'm scanning through a flock of golden eye, I'm not trying to focus on the head. I'm looking for a bird that has the sort of black that a Barrow's golden eye shows all over the back and the wing, and that little sort of what I call a spur underneath the head, that kind of black that goes pointing down across its chest down to the water. That's something that you pick up at a long ways, much easier than trying to discern the shape of a white spot on the head, especially if it's not giving you the right angle. So whenever I tell people they're trying to find a Barrow's golden eye, scan through the flocks and look at the backs of these birds. That's the key thing. That's what you're going to notice before you notice anything else. Couple of very tricky species here, lesser scaup and greater scaup. And they'll show up in huge numbers in places like Salt Pond. You'll see a raft of like several hundred of them out there sometimes. And unfortunately, they mix. So you can't just say, they're all greater scaup or they're all lesser scaup. This was taken at John's Pond. And these two birds here with the names right over them, the big difference I want to point out here is the head shape. Notice the peak on a greater scaup, the peak of the head is more towards the front. The peak of the head on a lesser scaup is more towards the back. The bill is also more slight, but if it's by itself, it can't always be easy to tell. There's usually a little bit more markings down the flanks of a lesser scaup, a little dirtier looking. It's usually cleaner and brighter on a greater scaup down the flanks. But notice the bill tip, and I tried to do little subsets down below here. The lesser scaup has that little narrow strip that just goes down the beak. And on a greater scaup, it just spreads out like it dipped its beak in a can of black paint. It just kind of spreads out over the front of the bill. And that's one of the best ways if it gives you the angle to ID it right away, because head shape can be tricky because they can take on different shapes depending on the behavior and different things they're doing. They just dove. There's a lot of things that can make the head shape look a little different, but that beak, they can't change. And if you can get a good look at that, that's a good clue. And in a large flock, they often will rear up and stretch their wings out. And a greater scaup has a lot of bright white that extends down the length of the wing. And lesser scaup, it's much brighter on the inner part of the wing, and it just kind of fades out towards the end. But they can be tricky. Another nice one to get around here once in a while is a Eurasian Widgeon. This one was out in Marston Mills last year. Didn't come terribly close, so I had to crop in quite a bit for this shot here for the slideshow. But you get the idea, much different than American Widgeon. They had that rusty head that really jumps out, and that cream color that goes across the top of the head. It's usually more white looking on an American Widgeon, and of course, they just don't have that that rusty colored head. They'll mix in together. So, if you see a flock of American Widgeon, scan through them really closely and sometimes look along the shoreline. I've seen them at Mill Pond by the library in town. That's a good spot for them. At least it used to be. That was years ago when I worked for Rhode Island Audubon, and I took a van trip out here, and 3 years in a row we had Eurasian Widgeon there. Of course, I haven't had one since I moved here, but I imagine they still show up there now and then. So a good place to look for them. And American Widgeon always show up there in good numbers, a few other places around town as well. And a bird that's just become rare, unfortunately, is the redhead. When they show up, people get all excited. This was over in Sandwich last year. There was actually a dozen or so of them swimming around the pond. This one swam up pretty close. And I remember when I was a kid, bird watching, I started when I was pretty young. I remember walking down to this lake in Coventry when I was in middle school, and there'd be a flock of like 50 or 60 of them out there. Now it is a rare thing and a rare bird alert no matter where you are in New England when one shows up. So it's kind of sad. They'll mix in once in a while with ringneck ducks or lesser scaup once in a while, birds like that. So always scan through the flocks closely. And tufted duck is another one that's pretty regular on Cape Cod, but there might be just like one around or maybe two around, and that's it. So a lot of people, when they learn of one, they're doing year lists, they'll just go out to wherever it's being reported and check it off. This was in on the border of East Providence and Seekonk several years ago. But this is a nice adult drake that makes it easy because nobody's going to mistake that tuft. Sometimes the tuft isn't so obvious. Sometimes it's a younger bird and it can look really similar to a ringneck duck or a scaup that's mixed in with. So sometimes it's tough. And what I do every now and then with that large flock at Salt Pond, and they've been seen there, by the way, I'll pull over, I'll find a spot with my spotting scope and I'll scan through all those scaup to see if I can find a tufted duck. And common eider, we have them all over the place here. In fact, they even nest on the Elizabeth Islands. And so you can see them year round, but of course in the winter we see a lot more of them from northern birds migrating into our area. And the king eider has been showing up in the Cape Cod Canal fairly regularly over the years, off and on, but quite a bit. And thanks to Bill McLaren for letting me borrow his photo for the slideshow here. Another fantastic photographer, always posting some amazing shots. And the long-tailed duck, we get in decent numbers here. A couple of winters ago, I was at Nobska Point scanning across Vineyard Sound. And one day I estimated, it was difficult because I'm watching flocks fly by and all you can do is do the best you can. But I estimated that day I probably had 8,000 to 10,000 long-tailed ducks flying by. It's just streaming by, large flock after large flock. It was pretty incredible. They'll come in close once in a while. The little waterfront park area down in Woods Hole, down near Minot Beach. I've seen them off of there. I've seen them off of Stony Beach and the Maravista, I think it's called Bridge. I don't know why they call it that because it's not even the name of the road. But anyway, you guys all probably know what I mean. That's another good spot for them. The long-tailed ducks are just absolutely gorgeous. And these are both males, by the way. A lot of people think that's a female on the left, but that kind of white on the back on the black wings makes that a young male, and the color in the bill as well. So we get some unusual gulls here once in a while. Certainly not like they get out in Provincetown and Truro and Wellfleet areas, but we still get some now and then. And lesser black-backed gull I've had on 3 different occasions at Woodneck Beach, and that's where this photograph was taken. And it can be a little trickier to ID when they are a younger bird like below. You can see a little bit of that gray setting in. At first glance, in certain light, a lesser black-backed gull can look like a great black-backed gull, but it is not as black on the back. In fact, it's a dark gray. And if you look closely, the wingtips that extend by the tail area there are very black. So you have that contrast. On a great black-backed gull, you have a black back that is the same color as those wingtips you see extending into the tail area. And in the winter, they always have what we call a dirty head. Some gulls get that in the wintertime. The lesser black-backed gull always has that. And then the yellow legs, which is also a unique combination with that dark back color. So there you have a lesser black-backed gull, yellow legs, dark gray back, black wingtips. And keep your eyes open because they'll mix in with a lot of other gulls. At Woodneck, I've seen them mixed in with herring gulls and great black-backed gulls as well. And the Iceland Gull, this one was actually taken last year down at Minot Beach. And it's a beautiful bird. I mean, look at how pale it is. You notice the wingtips, you notice it especially in the flying bird below, it's the same bird, does not have the black wingtips that a herring gull has. It's just very pale all the way through, just a striking bird. This is an adult bird. A young bird, where you see that pale gray color, it's whitish or almost all white. It can be variable, but you'll see a black bill, and you'll see an all-white bird with no black wingtips, and that's a first-year Iceland gull. But this was an adult, and it's been there a couple of years, so hopefully it shows up again this year. It could be, for all I know. I haven't really looked much this year. One day I was driving down Surf Drive, and I saw some laughing gulls sitting on a little jetty out there, and I'm like, wait a minute, one of those doesn't look right, and it turned out to be a black-headed gull. And that's a pretty rare bird. So that was exciting for me. That was a couple of years ago. Not a lot of people got to see it because it didn't stick around, not like the one at the canal last year, which is the photo above it. It was just the head shot there. But the one below was the one on Surf Drive. And notice the all reddish bill and the bright colored legs. In shape, in habit, and behavior, it's very similar to a Bonaparte skull you see here on the right, but a Bonaparte skull's bill is dark. And its legs have color, but they're not as bright as a black-headed gull. And the wing pattern is also different on a black-headed gull. Well, that's all I got for tonight, and I want to thank everybody for joining in. Hopefully I didn't put any of you guys to sleep. I know it was probably a little bit longer than I planned on it being, but thanks for sticking around if you did, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Check the chat here. Okay, let me go back to the beginning. Has the affliction affecting birds dissipated, gone away? Yes, that doesn't seem to be an issue. There hasn't been much talk about that. You know, it was something that there's a lot of theories. It coincided with some other problems, some other environmental issues that were going on. And when that waned, so did the birds dying off. Doesn't seem to be an issue anymore, but we still highly recommend to clean your feeders on a regular basis. You know, especially true when you're getting these unseasonably warm days when, you know, you can get a little growth in the seed once in a while if it's not sitting there, if it's sitting there for a long period of time. And that happens. You know, my seed hasn't moved a lot lately because it has been warm and they've been finding natural food. So, you know, it's always a good idea to clean them out on a regular basis and try to minimize any infection from, you know, different types of conjunctivitis that house finches spread and things like that. Have I seen hornlocks along Racing Beach? No, I have not spent a lot of time there though, but that would make sense. I could see it. You know, I have seen them over by Black Beach. Let's see, Beach back by, yeah, no, I'll have to check that out. It sounds interesting. What else we got here? Seen hundreds of crows flying towards Martha's Vineyard in the late afternoon. Yeah, so it's a common behavior among crows. And what we have here in Falmouth are a lot of fish crows in the winter. And there's a lot of common American crows as well. And what they do is they're very communal. And this is a common thing in a lot of areas. They all stream to one common roost area. And it's kind of like a strength in numbers sort of thing. And it just so happens to be, it's all the way over on Martha's Vineyard. And you'll see them leaving anywhere from Falmouth Harbor down through Woods Hole. And they're just all flying across the Martha's Vineyard. And it's a pretty amazing sight to see, really. And some of these roosts, I've seen one that was just several thousand. And it's absolutely unbelievable that they all go in together like that. But it's a pretty common thing. And most of them, around here do that. Very few will stick around at night. They all go out there. Pretty incredible sight. Best place for close views of long-tailed ducks. Well, yeah, the Woods Hole boat ramp for sure. Yeah, I remember last year especially, it was a great spot for them. I went kayaking in January last year and they were all around me in that harbor out there. I've driven by a couple times lately. I haven't noticed any, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're back. Well, thank you, Jill. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you. Not falling asleep at all. Good to hear. Well, I appreciate it, everyone.
Thank you for coming, everyone. Happy holidays. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Update on the local ravens.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I never followed through. I know Kevin Friel found the ravens nesting in a second spot after I found them nesting over near Walmart. And I just didn't have the time to go there to check on, you know, I did a couple of times notice them bringing food. So they were definitely feeding young. And lately I've been hearing common ravens quite a bit around Woods Hole. And a friend of mine who works over at MBL says they've been routinely right outside his window over at MBL. So the ravens are increasing for sure.
That's great.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.